oppressor mindset, victim mindset, me versus them, tribalism, in versus out group mechanics, all of that. That's all our base kind of cognitive biases that we have default. And so populism targets that so well. And so you mentioned, a flaw of populism is that it's very top down. It's kind of like the issue is like the elite, right? And it's like, okay, but you're not looking left or right to your neighbor. I wouldn't consider that a flaw. I mean, that's a problem. I wouldn't call it a flaw because I don't think it's accidental. I think that it is perfectly structured that way. I think people utilize that mechanism or that structure in order to get people to be upset about an entity that they can't control and change, so that whoever is, managing gets the vote. A lot of people, a lot of politicians, I will say, don't actually care, in my opinion, about making America better or making my life better or your life better. They want you to think they have the answers. They want you to hate another group and say they're the problem, and then they want to get voted in and make money, become popular, and get whatever they want pushed through. But they don't generally care about you. And so I think populism creates a perfect dynamic of blame a group of people for something, and we're never actually going to provide a solution, but because you're so upset about something, we're always going to have your vote. Let's go!
Welcome to the show, and feel free to interview us as much as we're interviewing you if you have questions about what we think or want to know things. But Carolyn, I appreciate your time, and why don't you just go ahead and tell us real quick about yourself? The audience knows who you are, your bona fides, all that stuff.
Yeah, so my name is Carolyn Kraft, and my page is Crafty Thinking. I'm mainly on Instagram. I have some YouTube and Substack. So some background, I'm a lawyer. I went to Vanderbilt for law school. I went to UCLA for undergrad, and I majored in political science. So I've done a lot of work in kind of like the political, legal area. I'm still a practicing attorney. I don't do a ton of work as an attorney. I mainly do pro bono work, actually. Most of what I'm doing now is content creation, and I do some business consulting on the side. And I just have always been really passionate about communicating with people, especially when it comes to academic subjects and topics. When I was at UCLA and at Vanderbilt, I noticed that people were always just arguing past each other, talking past each other, and inadvertently doing the straw man fallacy, where they were essentially just responding to an argument that didn't even exist or that wasn't actually the other person's argument. And it's
comment section ever.
Literally. And it is so frustrating to have to deal with. And then I was in law school, and I'm like, people are still doing this? It is literally our job to understand the opposing argument. And so many people were unable to do so or unwilling to do so. And there was so much just suppression of any counter opinions that weren't in line with academia at that time, which was like leftist, very liberal. And it was just very frustrating to watch. And I thought it was kind of embarrassing that a law school would have a student population like that. And I made the administration know that directly. I told them that. And so... So I was really big in law school in getting people to look at other opinions, specifically libertarian, conservative opinions, just different interpretations of the Constitution, originalism, textualism, all of that. And I kind of got into the pipeline of just becoming a lawyer because it's almost expected of you, and I didn't find it very satisfying. So that's when I became I became general counsel of a startup. Thoroughly enjoyed it, but at the same time started my content creation journey. And then just pivoted to that pretty much full time because I'm so passionate about making sure people actually understand what's going on and having civil conversations. Because at the end of the day, my goal is making America better, not having a specific political party win, right? And the only way to do that is through civil discourse, conversation, and figuring out actual policies that make us better.
I can't agree with you more. This is actually a stated goal of Chris and I's for a long time. Last year, we made a really hard pivot to that sort of exact thing and teaching people how to have an argument and talking about some of the same things that you're talking about. And one of the main things we focused on was healthy dialectic, and how when you have two competing sets of narratives, well, there is often truth in both, and then sort of not necessarily truth, but half truth inside of them, or more of an opinion on things. And that you have to learn how to accept that maybe something you think isn't exactly a fact, but more so an opinion, and then accept that yourself. And then the other person does too, and understand that that dialectic on the other end, when you come out, once you accept facts, is going to be a better form of conversation. And just essentially going back to this idea that you have to separate your ego from your opinion and be willing to intake information. And that's really, really hard for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that right now. And I think it's also tied to the separation, obviously the political divide here in the country. I think it's more than just political opinion. I think, like you were saying, it's an inability to even talk to each other. And it's gotten to the point now where there's a predatory aspect of that online, and it is driven by content creators, I think, because that sort of predatory content is what's the most popular. And for Chris and I, we do focus more on trying to keep our side honest. We tend to be more conservative and tend to go after some of the people on the right who prey on others and their want for information, and then basically their injection of bad information. And it's a sad reality, because we're unable to just talk, and that should be the thing that we are able to do the most. And any civilization, whether you're a tribe or tribe evolving into a city state evolving into an actual civilization of people, if you can't agree on things, well, then there's no ties that bind. There's no cohesion together. So this is quite literally the glue and the unraveling of everything. It's just communication, like you said. So I agree with you 100%.
So quick question. When you say
Sure.
influencers are predatory, on the right specifically, I mean, I have ideas of what you're saying, but I just want to make
Sure.
sure I understand exactly what you're saying. Can you just elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I'll give you a current example right now. There's this whole thing the past 2 days about the bullet that hit Charlie Kirk. Okay. And it fragmented in his body. And there's this really dumb narrative about how a 30-06 would not do this, the type of round that hit Charlie Kirk. And I'll say this too, and I'm going to let Chris talk. Chris is a special forces medic and would know this very well. And the disappointment for me is with other veterans who know this too, but are choosing to appeal to this grift because it's what drives clicks. And so the headline from the Daily Mail or whatever is that the bullet doesn't match the rifle. Okay. Actually, if you read the article, you'll see that the bullet fragmented, and because of its fragmentation, the results are inconclusive. Okay, it says inconclusive. It doesn't say it doesn't match. It's impossible for it to match because the bullet fragmented. So not only does this destroy this narrative that Candace Owens has been running with, that the bullet, there's no exit wound, and the 30-06 is too big of a caliber for something like that to happen, and Charlie's spine is just made out of steel, sarcastically. And now this has become the propaganda topic the past few days. So that's an example where we would, and we're going to on Friday in our live show, talk about it and be like, hey, you got to get past the headline. I thought we all understood this, and apparently we don't. So that's an example for you.
Oh, that's a perfect example. I was actually watching a video about it 10 minutes before I got on here with you guys. I was because it was talking exactly about how it fragmented, and it's not saying that it is not the bullet, that it's inconclusive. And there's a lot of other evidence that supports the argument that he did kill Charlie Kirk, right? And so it's just like people, and oh man, an influencer came on this morning that was like, just completely ran with the headline and said that the bullet doesn't match and he didn't kill Charlie Kirk and all of that. Just like, what? Like, that's not even what this article is even saying. And I mean, I already knew not to believe headlines, so I heard what this guy said and just assumed that it was probably wrong. And then because I just don't believe anything that's just said like that so quickly anymore. And then watched this other video that kind of broke down the reality of it. I almost reposted it on my Instagram. I probably will, because people need to understand what's actually going on here. But I completely agree. And I'm just going to like riff off of that, unless I think, Chris, you might have had something to say.
Oh, no, I'm actually really interested in where you're going with this, because I was hoping that as a lawyer, you would be able to unpack and help people understand that this was actually a motion that was introduced by the defense, and what they're arguing is the inconclusivity of the test. is saying that you can't match it to that gun because it was fragmented, and then everybody's taking that, and it's actually the defense's case that everybody's taking, unpacking, and then running with. And also, it would be really interesting to get your thoughts on the, I guess, the phenomenon of the public, or I guess the current day case by public scrutiny. We almost live in a place where it's like you can't even have a neutral trial by a jury of your peers because all of these cases become so tried in the public space before anybody hears anything about it that everybody's like made up their mind based on what they want to be directionally true. And I'm totally stealing something from you there, Brandon, to say that, but it's the truth. So please continue with where you're going with all that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you described it perfectly. I've done some true crime work also on my YouTube channel. So I've covered kind of how, actually I did the whole Karen Reed thing. And so I've covered how, the public can take certain things and just twist it, and how people don't actually understand how the law works or how courts work or trials work. And they'll just create a conclusion on their own and then just parrot it all over online. And it's really frustrating. But that's not just with true crime. That also has to do with constitutional law. People don't understand what precedent is. They don't understand what, the amendments are supposed to actually be. They don't understand what originalist interpretation is versus textualist versus the living document progressive view of what the Constitution is. And that's a whole separate rant I can go on. But what I was essentially going to kind of riff off of what you were talking about initially is this idea. This is so fascinating to me because, Brandon, you said this. You said, I thought we learned not to just read the headline. I mean, I did too. But what I see as happening is back in around COVID time, okay, I witnessed, or a lot of people witnessed, a lot of people who consider themselves liberal or Democrats move towards the Republicans or independent because they were upset with how the Democrats were handling COVID. And you had this almost economic competition between the South and the North, and that the South stayed open, booming economically, and everyone in the North was like, I can't make any money, my job's dying, my kids aren't going to school, and you really witnessed this conflict. And you also witnessed a lot of information coming out and pushed by the Democrats that wasn't necessarily 100% accurate. And so people were getting really upset. And then also, laws for thee and not for me and all of that. So people got really upset about that, and they started moving more independent and Republican. And it seems that a lot of the people that went to the right saw liberal media or Democrat-leaned media, and said, okay, well, we can't trust them. But the Republicans were really truthful to us during COVID, so we can trust them every single time. And so they essentially only view the left in a specific way and then just assume everything that's pushed by the right is like perfectly truthful because previously in their mind it already was. But I think people need to recognize the Republicans are still a political party and media is still media. And you can't just assume that because they agreed with you one time or they were truthful one time that suddenly they're going to be truthful forever. You have to continue to, truth test any political party, any politician, any media, and make sure that they're actually standing true to telling you the full story. And so I think what's happening is the right is falling into the same trap that a lot of people might have fallen into during COVID, because they're automatically assuming that their political party is truthful just because they were previously, or they agreed with the political party previously. But that's not necessarily the case.
Can I back you
agree
up
completely
on what you're saying really quick and use an example from early in Trump's second term, his second administration? This is one of the reasons that the president has a popular mandate talking point was parroted so hardly and pushed, because like they were trying to generate this idea that all of these disaffected liberals that came over here, look, we have the political headwinds with which to do all of these and push all of these policies that we've been wanting to push for so long. That's why it was so important to get everybody behind the idea that it's like, oh, Trump 2.0 has the public's mandate to do all of these things that like he's going on to do. And now there's a lot of people that are all of a sudden digging their heels in over war with Iran or over, maybe other foreign policy decisions that are being made, and they're like reflecting or rebounding off of this and kind of getting that whiplash feeling of what you're talking about, where it was like, well, we came out of COVID and we thought you had our back, and you talked about, no new wars and blah, 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 and all this and that. And then now all of a sudden you're pushing into a direction that we didn't necessarily want to go. Wait, you mean Republicans lie too? And it's like, yeah. And now here we are. Right. But I just wanted to kind of draw that narrative through line, because people have generally the memory length of a goldfish, and they kind of forgot. It's like, you do have to tie these political narratives together and remember why they were saying what they were saying when second Trump term started,
I think COVID brought a lot of people into politics because it affected their lives completely and totally. That seems to be what happens with people, is they don't care about things until it affects them personally. COVID hit hard on a lot of people. And to your point, Carolyn, the Republican Party introduced a solution to that, and it was so easy to present one that was just the exact opposite of what was going on. And it was appealing because it just, everything else that was going on was so wrong. Honestly, people's lives were kind of falling apart. But I think what we're seeing now is the part of this political tent that has become disaffected with the right, because they were politically homeless sort of to begin with. And maybe they tended to lean more left, or they didn't necessarily pay attention as much as others did. And they just knew whatever was happening was wrong. They thought they found a solution, and now they don't like what's happening. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think there's a lot of people who don't recognize that a lot of these people who are upset right now, that obviously there's justifiable reasons to be upset. That's not what I'm trying to say, but there's a lot of disaffected people from, I think, the traditional classically left group who came into the right's tent, and they're unhappy. And they may agree on some of the domestic issues, or they may agree on some of the foreign policy issues, but there's no full disagreement, and they're not getting everything they want right now. And I think that's part of it too. And so what you're just seeing is a lot of people who are still sort of politically homeless, and there's not a large representation of their political values in American political discourse right now. Because like you said, the Republican Party hasn't recognized that what they're doing is still not what everybody is sick of. It's almost kind of wild. You're watching somebody make a mistake that you thought that they understood, that everybody understood to be very obvious, and yet they're rolling with it and asking you to still sort of eat this sandwich. And it's going to lose them a lot of voters, and it's going to lose them a lot of people who believed, I guess, in what they were saying, because they still think this grift is the way to go about things. People, they don't understand too, like there's bad parts of the democratization of information online. And we're sort of talking about that. There's a very good thing about the democratization of information online too, with people who can see things happening in real time, especially when you have a president who's so active online, and then his administration is also very active online. And so it's just the emperor has no clothes, we like to say around here, and nobody believes that he does. And it's, if they can't recognize that and start changing the conversation and acknowledging that people aren't as dumb as you think they are, as this is the perception, then you're just going to keep losing people. And no matter what good you do, it's never going to be enough. It's going to be this bottomless pit of upset, and disaffection, in my opinion. But
yeah, I wrote an article about this on Substack, but essentially I made the argument that the independents are increasing so much because, I guess, I've looked back historically. I was like, I think a lot of people left the Democrats under COVID. I think they moved to the right. They moved under Republicans, or they moved to the independents. Now I think a lot of those people that left the Democrats are leaving the Republicans because, in my opinion, in the argument, I said they're actually classical liberals. They don't actually agree with the conservatives on everything. And one could argue that a lot of conservatives don't agree with what's going on in the administration right now either. But definitely the classical liberals don't. And so they're now moving into the independents. And it's interesting because it's like, if we look at, a lot of people are kind of freaking out about the internet and how this is affecting people and all of that. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to freak out, because to a degree I'm really concerned as well. But we have to remember that the internet is still new when it comes to modern history, to humans, civilization, right? Social media is still really new. So we had one iteration of this happening when COVID-19 happened on the left. We might be having a similar iteration of what's happening on the right. But what I'm hoping comes from this is kind of growth towards hey, we need to look at this from a more nuanced perspective. We need to hold our political leaders and our media accountable for what they're saying. And we need to disengage or call people out when they are spewing lies. And we need to support people who are not spewing lies, or who are not trying to twist the narrative or anything like that. And I think that's where we're going and growing. I hope that is, especially because I think what's being combated right now, or what is being fought against, is, and you kind of mentioned like predatory influencers and stuff. There are a lot of people that are being paid to say certain things online, or they came out with a certain opinion or supporting a specific politician, and they're too scared to backtrack, or their audience only supports them if they support that politician. And well, the audience is paying the bills, so they can't add nuance to the conversation anymore. And so that's kind of what's being battled right now. But I want to say, and I'm hoping that we're moving away from that as people awaken and recognize that a lot of the influencers that are pushing a specific narrative and just have or two-dimensional opinions are just paid. And then the influencers that are actually trying to engage with their audience and propose more nuanced perspectives are the ones that should be, lifted up and focused on.
I do see a shift there as well. There's a few people that I pay attention to that are like that, in that vein. I pay attention to the grifters, I'll call them too, because I want to see what they're saying, because it has to be combated, right? This is a battlefield for information. But I totally agree with you. Unfortunately, I think that the algorithmically captured people like you're talking about that will keep talking about this stuff, they're not going to unless something is done. And I don't want to see regulatory practice make that happen with people being deplatformed. I've had that happen to me before, being deplatformed or being community striked and shadow banned and all this stuff. What needs to happen, like you said, is people walking away from those individuals and punishing them for what they're doing. Like, that has to happen. And people have to be, again, willing to separate their ego from their opinion and be willing to hear truth wherever it comes from, no matter who's saying it, right? And I think that there are a lot more people now who are willing to do that, but I still think people want to see the establishment itself do this, and they're holding out hope that somebody from the establishment is going to show up and behave this way. And I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that people have to understand that this change that you want has to come from the bottom up. It's never going to come from the top down. And that means people have to get involved locally and then, work their way up. And that we have to confront the fact that this isn't going to be an overnight change. I think people want that, and I think that is an unhealthy mindset to have. There's another conversation we had with another person. She's a constitutional law or constitutional history professor, and we sort of talked about the how small the Constitution itself is and the language it is, because the founders understood that time goes on and eventually the interpretation of the Constitution would change with its people, and they understood that. So it was intentionally kept to be small, and that our interpretation of what it means to be an American today is no longer compatible, I think, with the last 60, 70 years, because the world has changed, the like post World War II world, as it were, and that people have to get back to understanding what the intent was with our founding documents and get to know them, and then understand that the institution itself is only existing and defending itself to exist in a form that no longer fits what people believe in anymore, and then get involved and be, whatever it is that you think you want the United States to be, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
There's a point that both of you made that I think is really profound, in that, we know that there's the hardcore polls on both sides, the kind of neo-Marxist liberal progressive, obviously, on one side, and then the very hardcore MAGA on the other, which is very tied to Donald Trump himself as a kind of a cult of personality, right? So excluding those, you both talked about how the middle and the independent segment is growing. And I think that's the really interesting part of it, at least from my perspective, is that their politics don't seem to be positively driven. They seem to be negatively driven. And what I mean by that is you heard a lot of them, especially the disaffected liberal, like you were talking about, Brandon. The line was kind of, I didn't leave the left left me, and I'm still here. Like the Overton window blew out on both sides, and I'm still standing here, right? Like Elon Musk even famously shared a political cartoon to that effect. And then a lot of people are now finding themselves kind of in that camp from the right as well, especially over foreign policy issues like Israel, the Iran war, so on and so forth. But when I say that their politics are negatively driven, what I mean is like they're looking, and their voting pattern is based on, well, I know I'm not for that, which leaves me with, because of our federal election system, one alternative usually. But very few of them are actually positively driven in the sense of like they're excited about certain policy direction. It's just, I know I don't want that. Like whatever happened during COVID, not going with that again, right? Or trans ideology, I don't like that, right? But I'm not necessarily like excited for what we're doing over here on the right, you know, especially immigration policy. Like there's a lot of hot button issues that you can throw in there. But I think that part of it is very telling, that kind of neither of the political parties right now, at least as they're constituted, have, or at least they're going to have this problem moving forward, I think, in tapping back into something that actually positively motivates the independent in the middle. I'm excited to get behind this movement. It's like, until you can do that, we're going to continue to see political rift get bigger, and elections are going to continue to balkanize to where it's just, how much of my base can I turn out at an election? Can I motivate to get there? Not that I'm going to ever reach across the aisle and try to build bridges anymore, you know? And I see that as a huge problem. I don't know what you guys think about that, but
it's like voting for the lesser of two evils.
right.
Like that's essentially what everyone seems to feel, or a lot of people feel like they're doing. And they don't like either political party or the one that they do vote for, but it's not like there's a better option. And you're totally correct. There's no pause. No one's like, oh, I'm really excited for this person. All right. And I think part of it, I want to say that part of it might be due to the way we consume content nowadays. Negative stories always have been, kind of put in front of us. And now with algorithms and social media, everything is just negative. So to a degree, I think it's just easier for us to dislike something. It's always easier to criticize than propose a solution. And I think a lot of people just kind of fall into that as well. And I think our society is kind of designed for that. That's just another element to consider. And I would like to see people doing a little more research on their own and being able to support policies that they actually believe in, and that are, nothing is perfect, but at least aren't just ideologically driven, or because their professor said that they should have this belief, or because it's just not Donald Trump, or it's not the Democrats, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, actually, what you just said, I think, is one of the bigger problems today, is that people just don't like it because it is coming from Trump, or they don't like it because it's coming from Democrats. And again, I think that's more of an ego thing. And I think it's easier to offload your thinking to excusing it because it comes from somebody or a specific group of people, rather than developing the nuance to be able to speak on it and then have a real opinion. I think that's most people, or too many people at least. And it actually kind of leads me into something I wanted to talk to you about. You had talked about populism on your Instagram page before. And I sort of have this opinion that most people won't keep their attention on politics any longer than it takes to stop affecting them personally, and then they'll just divert their attention to whatever is going on in their personal lives, and not like shaming people for that necessarily, because that's just what people have to do. But I think that there's a smaller group of people who can and will and want to focus on politics more than they do their personal lives, I guess. And those people are always going to dictate the conversation, because most people just aren't that way. And it sort of comes to this concept, I think, of populism. I wanted to ask you, when you describe it, it sounds like both sides, whether it's the populist left or the populist right, view things as an us versus them. And it's normally, a top-down us versus them. And I think that there's a problem there because there's not enough left-right accountability. And when I say left-right, I don't mean politically left or politically right. I mean like to the person to your left, the person to your right, and then personally, there's not a lot of accountability going on. And that I think that's one of the critical errors in populism is that it's this oppressor-oppressed mentality where you put all the blame on a group of people rather than looking where you can fix problems yourself. And then there's this notion that a lot of Americans have gotten into of the government is there to solve problems, and that the government is there to be this person or that, in loco parentis, to operate on your behalf at all times, which isn't the reality. And that, Americans traditionally would tell you, like, the more freedom you have is is measured in what you're doing for yourself, not what other people are doing for you. So I wanted to ask, do you think that populist movements historically or traditionally here in the United States truly represent their constituents writ large, or is it just a fad insofar as I know I'm suffering right now? This political movement seems to be representative of things that I directionally agree with, so I'm just going to almost offload my concern onto that group over there as the problem. And then eventually my attention towards it will fade, and whatever the fallout is, it'll be, and I don't really care. Do you kind of see what I'm saying there?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
So I will say I haven't done a ton of research into populism. It's not like I wrote a research paper on it or studied a ton. I do have knowledge, a political science background and everything like that. So from my perspective, it is a fad because I think it perfectly targets people's cognitive biases. And I hate saying cognitive biases because I say it so much. I feel like people are just like, shut up. Like, you go on my Substack, I talk about it so much, but it is so integral to everything that's going on. And I think it's so important to understand the amount of times I say you guys should read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I say that way too much on my Substack, but I mean, you'd think he was paying me, but he's not.
I have that book.
What?
I have that book.
It's a great book. Have you read it? It's a great book. Mm-hmm. So the oppressor mindset, victim mindset, me versus them, tribalism, in versus out group mechanics, all of that's all our base kind of cognitive biases that we have default. And so populism targets that so well. And so you mentioned a flaw of populism is that it's very top down. It's kind of like the issue is like the elite, right? And it's like, okay, but you're not looking left or right to your neighbor. I wouldn't consider that a flaw. I mean, that's a problem. I wouldn't call it a flaw because I don't think it's accidental. I think that it is perfectly structured that way. I think people utilize that mechanism or that structure in order to get people to be upset about an entity that they can't control and change, so that whoever is, managing gets the vote, right? A lot of politicians, I will say, don't actually care, in my opinion, about making America better or making my life better or your life better. They want you to think they have the answers. They want you to hate another group and say they're the problem. And then they want to get voted in and make money, become popular, and get whatever they want pushed through. But they don't generally care about you. And so I think populism creates a perfect dynamic of blame a group of people for something, and we're never actually going to provide a solution. But because you're so upset about something, we're always going to have your vote.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think that we don't even agree. This is kind of what I was trying to say earlier when I was talking about the size of the Constitution and then the people's interpretation of America. Because you have to, if you're going to talk about your interpretation of America, you have to consider our founding documents because of the driving principle behind that. And I don't think I articulated that well enough before. Sort of the point I'm trying to get at here is I don't think we agree on what America is anymore. And I think that most people, and I blame GWAT on I got to stop using that acronym, Global War on Terror. I don't think that's what I mean when I say GWAT. I think the GWAT ruined a lot of people and their opinion on the United States and what the United States is doing. And I say that not necessarily to blame at all. I'm not blaming service members in any way, shape, or form by saying that. What I'm saying is that it was such a gross representation And I don't mean gross as in large, I mean like disgusting representation of what politicians, coupled with the military industrial complex, coupled with political money, all that stuff will do no matter what and to what end on the backs of people, people's trust, on the blood of service members. All of this stuff is what I'm saying. And it created a lot of people who don't trust the government anymore, rightfully, for a lot of reasons. It also created a very, very bad taste in the mouth of people traditionally who are not Americans, who would have seen the U.S. as an ally. And now that right there is a benchmark for what American foreign policy is, which is why now this whole conversation about Iran is tied to, well, this is what happened in Iraq, or this is what happened in Syria, or this is what happened in Afghanistan, or whatever. And to function, you have to get out of that mindset. You can be weary of it, and you should be, because you don't want to make the same mistakes you did before. But you have to understand that if you're going to continue to exist, that you can't use the past to constantly paint the present or the future. You know, it just has to be a lesson, and you have to move on. And so I don't think people agree on what America is anymore. I think I see that a lot of people on this far right, I suppose, the only way I can interpret what they think and how they feel is that they are anti-interventionalists, they're isolationists, and one way, shape, or form. Whether I think that there's people who are isolationists insofar as like a traditional Monroe Doctrine isolationist, or just the continental United States isolationist, but both of them are anti-interventionalists around the world. And I think that's a scary concept to hold, because it shows just sort of a lack of understanding at how integrated the global economy is, and it's centered on the United States. We're the world's reserve currency. I don't think people even understand really what that means, because then you start talking about something like SWIFT, and they've never even heard of that. You know, so there's all these things that I think people are just uneducated on, to your opinion, but we can't agree on what we want the United States to be. Most people just want affordable groceries, they want affordable gas, they want to see themselves represented in their community, and these are very simple things. You know, they don't care necessarily about the complexity of the IRGC, or the complexity of the differences in Shia and Sunni Muslims, or whatever is going on, and having to navigate all that. They don't care. Their kids going to school, they have a job, you know, and there's nobody that is presenting this is what America should be, right? And here are American values. This is what the Constitution says. This is what the Constitution means. You know, this is what America should be and traditionally has been, or whatever, or the idealistic or idealism of America has been. There's nobody presenting like a light off in the distance as a way to move towards it. There's just people picking apart everybody's, I guess, misunderstanding on what America is supposed to be, which is why I think the America First MAGA movement this time fell apart so fast, because everybody was like, yeah, America First, but then nobody stopped to ask one another what that actually meant. You know, it's just like, yeah, America First. Wait, this isn't what America First is, you know? And so it's so important, I think, to understand our history, and then to my point before, the founding documents. But there has to be some representation now of somebody taking all of this and talking about it and presenting a way forward and a new idea of what America is, and what that has to mean, and not just trying to hold up Weekend at Bernie's style whatever was going on before and be like, this is still the path. Well, I can't buy groceries, and gas is $6 a gallon. You know, so what is the actual way forward? Because this doesn't look like America to me. You know what I mean? So yeah,
can I jump in on that?
Sure.
I think that there's a legitimate malicious reason for that, and I'm not arguing for like uniparty here necessarily, but what I am trying to say is like bad faith actors on both let's just call it the political right, and I'm just using like the political terminology for this. I'm not fundamental definitions of conservative or liberal or whatever. I'm just saying people who wear the red tie versus people that wear the blue tie, right? For sake of getting elected. But you have kind of bad faith actors on the political right-hand side of the spectrum that want to see the United States go in a certain direction with their foreign policy. Kind of, you would title them like neocon, neoconservative, foreign American imperialism kind of thing, war industrial complex and that kind of stuff, right? They want to see the United States continue to progress that direction. in the same vein that people on the left-hand side of the aisle want to see America kind of progress toward a socialism, right, or more communistic in governmental tendencies. And because both of those directions and bad faith actors in both of those movements want to see the United States move further away from kind of fundamental constitutionalism, further away from what our founding fathers put in the documents, it becomes advantageous to both of those movements to stay to stay as far away from the founding documents and the idea of what is America, right? Those fundamental ideas as possible, because both of them, I think, are trying to move away from fundamental, the idea of what America was supposed to be. They're just moving away from it in different directions. Does that make sense? Did I frame my thought well enough? Do you?
I understand what you're saying. I guess after hearing both of what you're both saying, my question is, so what is the path forward? Because you mentioned the idea that the Constitution was meant to be very small, and the reason being is because over time it gets interpreted and the world changes and all of that. Okay, the world has changed. The Constitution, the world is not exactly as it was written or when the Constitution was written. So what is the path forward through all of this? What are the foundational principles that we want to continue forward? And not only that, how do we do that? Because where I'm really kind of getting stuck on is that a lot of people in America don't like the foundation of America, or at least they think they don't like it because they don't even understand what it actually is. And so when we have morals or principles or beliefs or virtues that are so opposed or just so different, how do we find a common ground moving forward?
I think that I totally agree with you. I think that I'm a millennial. I don't like saying that. I like to say I'm Gen Y because I hate that term, millennial. Most of us were raised to sort of hate, I guess, the founding of the United States and focus more on the bad things that happened. And there were bad things that happened. There's not a country on the face of this earth that doesn't have its sins, you know. But I don't think that the sins of the United States did take away from the wholesomeness or the morality of something like free speech and the ethicalness of free speech. Free speech is free speech. That's a founding principle. That is something that everybody should have. You know, you talked about communication before. You know, all this bad stuff going on doesn't make the concept of the First Amendment null and void, right? The Second Amendment, right? Like the right to form a militia, the right to own a weapon, like all of these things, you know, that's still true. You know, I think that's very representative today as well, still about, you know, the sort of oppression that's going on in the United States. If you have no ability to fight back, then, okay, well then you're going to lose those rights. Like that's just fundamental, you know. I think people have to be willing to separate the negative things about our founding and understand and look at them as lessons, and then not throw the baby out with the bathwater necessarily and say like, well, then this whole thing needs to be redone. Like, I don't think it necessarily needs to all be redone. I think that those principles on their own still stand up regardless of people's imperfections and the horrible things we've done to one another. They're not going to prevent all of those things from happening because human beings are imperfect beings. But what they are, and what people I think fail to understand, is that the United States or any country that's ever tried to hold up these principles, it's an experiment in how long you can keep doing those things. It's always something to aspire to. It's never a place where we've just reached and now this is this utopia where everybody has free speech and we all agree and it's just wonderful. Like it's always meant to be a practice over and over and over again. Your rights have to be fundamentally practiced, you know, and I think that might be a way to move forward, is to like try to educate people on understanding that these principles still have values and still have meaning and can still be guidance for you, even with all the bad that's gone on. They're not necessarily the reason why all of this negativity happened. I guess, you know, the First Amendment didn't make chattel slavery happen. It didn't make, you know, the civil rights era happen, you know. So that's what I would say to that.
I think a fundamental portion of us moving forward has to come from education, and specifically education of like the younger children, elementary school. I don't think that's like, I would say that a significant portion, if not all, of education in this United States has been captured by one side of the political aisle. And I wouldn't even argue that it needs to be like retaken and given to the other side of the political aisle. I think that there is an argument to be had that education should be balanced, across the political spectrum, at least balanced, right? But no country or society can withstand entire generations of its children being taught to hate it fundamentally for what it is. And I think any path forward has to involve the reclaiming of education. That has to happen.
Yeah, it's always been okay to acknowledge that chattel slavery is wrong, or any other negative foreign policy the United States has had around the world that's created chaos and death for other people, to say like those things are wrong. Like you should own those things, but it shouldn't become an apology tour wherein you become a self-hating group of people over generations. That's just going to destroy whatever uniting principles you had over time. It becomes everything is inherently bad about me and inherently bad about the fabric of my country, I guess. The founding documents still are what they are without people and their poor decision making or their malicious decision making or whatever has gone on. And have they prevented, you want to have the conversation about have they prevented those things from happening? No, because people are not always going, this is like a perfect world we're talking about. They're always going to subvert ideals and morality. Like that's just always going to be the way of people. It just involves you not letting this get out of hand to the point where you're trusting everybody implicitly to just always have your best interests at heart. Like you have to get involved locally and be a part of something as minuscule as your school board versus who's representing you, your state government and then federal government, all of this stuff. Like it just requires this notion we say here that citizenship isn't passive. You can't relinquish it. Freedom is not the government letting you just go about your day, because everything is taken care of. Like at that point, you are an animal in a zoo. You're not a free person. Like freedom looks like responsibility, and freedom looks like you having to do more with your day. Freedom is not the ability to sit on the couch and collect a paycheck from the government. Like that's not freedom. Like you are now dependent. And I think and it's crazy because you would think that people would have learned that during COVID, just how dependent they are on the government, and this whole food stamp thing as well, that you're so dependent on food stamps, you're mad about it. It's like, I think that there is a conversation to be had about food stamps and, welfare as a total thing. I don't think it should go away because there are people who need help to get back on their feet, and there are people who just need a little assistance and then will go about their life, because they got back on their feet. I don't have a problem with it in totality. I have a problem with it becoming a business model, I guess. But you would think people would learn to not be dependent, understand what that freedom actually means, So I don't think you need to redo the whole thing to answer your question. I think that it, again, requires personal accountability, and then you just paying attention and getting involved and understand that the system, it's great. And it's, this awesome thing that provides things for you, but it's because the reason why it's there is because people at one point or another in our history were so involved that these infrastructures were stood up. You can't just take them for granted, I suppose.
So I agree with what you're saying, but my issue is I continue to bang my head against the wall when I'm actually trying to figure out a way how to implement this. Because let's take the Second Amendment, for example.
Sure.
You have the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Okay, you also have tons of school shootings, and you have a lot of gun deaths. And so you have individuals who feel that guns should be either heavily regulated or just completely removed from the marketplace, like Australia style. And how are we to explain to individuals the importance of the Second Amendment when they haven't experienced what happens when the Second Amendment is taken away? It's almost like we've gotten to a point where we have become so comfortable with where we're at and the safety of our, current developed world experience that we don't even understand. We can't conceptualize how bad it can actually be once the government takes these things away from you, or once you don't have access to them. And you have people, they know what's going on in Iran. They know all the civilians were getting murdered by their government, but that could never happen in America.
Well,
the entire Constitution was written because that could happen in America, because it can happen with every government.
Correct.
But people don't understand that. And so how are you supposed to explain that without having an actual example of it happening here on American soil? That's where I struggle. And it comes with the First Amendment too. I do a thing called Followers Forum on my Instagram, where I ask my followers a question. They get to write a poll, they get to take the poll, and then they DM me their answer. And then I create a carousel where people can look at that. So I once asked, do you think that freedom of speech should be absolute? And if not, explain what regulation you would suggest. Or maybe the question was like, do you think hate speech should be illegal? Something like that. A large majority of the individuals who voted said that free speech should not be absolute. And one of the biggest reasons was because of hate speech online.
Yeah.
How do you explain to people that once you start regulating hate speech, the definition of hate speech is going to turn and change into whatever administration thinks hate speech is? And I wrote about this on my Substack as well. You might think that the current party in power is great and they agree with you, and that's why that when you pass that law, it's going to be all fine and dandy until the next political party comes into power. What happens then? How do they utilize it?
This is something I bang my head against the wall too, because I read a lot of history, and it sucks because there are so many examples of what you're talking about throughout history where you could point to say, hey, if you read this book, this person lived through what you're talking about, and that it won't matter at all to anybody because they're like, well, that was then, this is now. And there's always this notion that it'll be different this time, and it really never is, like human beings have not changed that much throughout time. And so it's just this massively frustrating thing. And so I've thought about this as well too, and I've even talked about this too from like the original founding angle, and saying like this is something that the anti-federalists pushed up as a critique of federalism, was that the concept of rights don't account for the accountability that should come with rights, and that people themselves, they have to protect those rights by participating in it, and understand like you have to participate in your government. Your rights sound too inherent and too entitled, right? So that was sort of this critique, anti-federalist critique of federalism. But I would say that my solution, or my idea of a solution would be almost like, I don't want to see mandatory like military service. I don't like that idea. And the reason I don't like it is because there are already enough people that I've served with who got into the military and realized it wasn't for them and didn't want to be there, but had to be there because the option was either serve or jail, or find a way to be a piece of crap and get treated like crap until they kick you out. So I don't want that, because those people already exist in the military. But I think that there should be some form of civil service. There could be an option, like you've got until 25 to do 3 years of either military service or civil service, or whatever that looks like, and have some sort of participatory experience in what it means to keep the United States going, whether that means you're now working in a government office, or you're working in the military, or you are, I don't know, you're volunteering at a juvenile hall prison thing. You're getting to see the experience of what it is for kids who grow up on the streets, and why it's so important for adults to be involved in the lives of children, or whatever you're getting, to understand that you have some skin in the game here in the United States. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem, like you said, of like just not having an experience, and so therefore you don't know better. Kind of the military would solve that in a way, because I've been to plenty of places that are what you're describing. Like there is just a total lack of rights. I use this story all the time of a woman who was living in the area I was deployed in Kenya, and had her arms cut off because she was talking about prophylactics. That would never happen here in the United States. And if it did, it would be national news. But over there, it's common practice for Al-Shabaab to do things like that to women, especially. You can't, that's a lived experience, right? Those kids that witnessed this at this like youth shelter, okay, are now going to remember that for the rest of their lives. There is no solution for a lived experience like this. And I think part of it is an erosion of institutional trust, because this is traditionally what an institution would say, like, hey, listen, this is what we've all sort of established this institution as a way to be a guiding principle. You have to be involved in it to keep it on the rails. But there's no institutional trust anymore. People don't trust it, and anything that they say now pretty much is taken as being false, which isn't a good thing. This is why a lot of the discourse is unraveling, and you have these predatory influencers online who are able to do what they do. So I don't know, you asked such a good question. I'm like actually trying to solve it here on this podcast. Like I'm going to, but like, it just, I don't think there is a solution outside of lived experience, and that history would show that no matter reading a book for some people or listening to others who've lived through communism or lived through, like, if one of these kids grows up that I talked about in Kenya and comes to the United States and tells the story about their, the counselor they watched have her arms cut off in front of them, not everybody's going to listen to that. They're just gonna be like, oh man, that was a one-off. And it really isn't a one-off. It just happened over there and it didn't affect your life. And I think you're talking about the human condition, because this is what people are. They don't care if it doesn't affect them. And unfortunately, I think this is like the what's the word I'm looking for here? The cruelty of being somebody, or the cruelty you experience as a person who pays so much attention to history, is that nobody's listening. They don't care, because it's something that happened before, and it's going to be different this time, I guess. So that sounds really doom and gloom. So sorry, guys.
I'm really doom and gloom. So
yeah, no, you're good.
I'm gonna state my case again for educational reform, because that would be something that if in a normal high school education, if you were getting introduced to a world economics class or something like that was genuinely looking at what economic conditions are like, or civilizational conditions are like in other countries, realistically, and not through rose-tinted glasses of, it's like, oh, well, we look at communistic countries with favoritism, and look how technologically advanced China is, right? Because it's like we want to show them in a favorable light, but you're not seeing what's happening out in Xinjiang. Like, that's not being covered, right? Because it's like, oh, well, that would shine a bad light on that. And then, of course, whenever we talk about America, we're only ever talking about America and its flaws, right? But if you were presenting high school students with an education that was balanced and really showing things, you could start whittling away at some of these perceptions that you guys were talking about. And two, I was kind of thinking it's just an interesting anecdote, but worth kind of unpacking for funsies, because we actually have a lot of Mormon guys that serve in special forces. There's like a whole host of reasons for this, but because of their mission, and a lot of them already have a second language and have overseas travel experience and stuff like that, they actually make very good special forces candidates by and large. But it's very, very interesting if you look inside of the Mormon community, like they're overwhelmingly conservative, overwhelmingly Republican. And I'm not going to say that it's all because of their world travel experience, but that can't hurt, because if they've been to other countries and they've seen the things that you guys are mentioning and you're talking about, and I was kind of laughing too, because it's like, Brandon, we're both global war on terror vets. Like, I've been to the Middle East. I've seen how bad things can be. You've been to Africa and I think the Middle East as well, right? Like, you've seen how bad things can be. Like, that puts an indelible mark on you. I was thinking about the cartoon, and it's kind of funny, but the dad who sees his kids like not want to eat or whatever, doesn't want to eat bread with crust on it. When I've literally seen Afghani children like throw hands over an MRE cookie, it's like, you guys don't know how good you got it, right? Is the idea of the cartoon, but it is true. And again, just wrapping it up, I personally think educational reform is got to be one of the spokes to solving a lot of the problems that we're identifying.
I would agree with you on that. I generally lean towards trying to change the society on a cultural level or via education rather than laws, just because laws scare me. But I do agree with the education. That's why I know how they work now.
Right?
But
No. Yeah.
like, but what you say about traveling is so interesting to me because I totally agree with you. That being said, when it really depends on the kind of traveling that's going on, which is obvious by the way you're talking about traveling, but I just really want to like add a little bit more to that because I would say most people who travel for fun travel and become more left-leaning and more liberal and more open to different ideologies and ideas and all of that. And I'm not saying necessarily being open-minded is a bad thing. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what you do when you travel is a big deal, and it's going to determine whether you lean more conservative or more leftist.
Correct.
When it comes to these kinds of ideas. Because if you are just bouncing around hostels, hanging out with a bunch of 20-year-olds drinking and stuff, and like, oh, it's super fun to do whatever you want, whenever you want, and like, I'm going to be more open to all of that, you're going to come back with a different worldview. So I've traveled a lot, and a lot of my traveling had to do with business because my dad, he owned a company and it went international, and he ended up having partners in China. So I've been to Hong Kong, I've been to Vietnam, I've been to Indonesia multiple times, South Korea. I've been to a lot of places over there. Also, South America and Central America. But when I go to these places, I have vacation there, but a lot of what I've done is actually work related. And my dad, when he partnered with these individuals and he has partnerships across the ocean, he works with employees that are low income or lower income. And my dad is a very ethical guy. So he will go every time he works with, to add a little backstory, it's a fish company. So, seafood that you eat, that's what it is. So if he goes to a plant in Indonesia, he goes to the plant that he's working with. He'll go in and spend an entire day there to make sure that the employees there are getting proper meal breaks, bathroom breaks, all of that, because he doesn't want to work with another company that treats their employees like crap. And he asks them, like, what are they paid? And he tries to figure out, like, what the average amount of money that individuals need to survive and all of that standard of living. Yeah. And so I've gone to those plants, and I've gone to the small fishing villages that have used some of his products and incorporated them in their fishing practices. So I've seen the darker side, or the lower income side of things that I think a lot of people don't see when they travel the world, but they think they're seeing. They're flying all over Europe and they're like, oh, I'm super well traveled, and this is my viewpoint, and this is why the Constitution is BS, and this is why the founding fathers are assholes and whatever. And it's like, okay, but did you go to the low income areas in Vietnam or in Indonesia? Have you actually talked to the people that live there? Have you studied the history? And so I guess I'm just kind of supporting what you guys said, but adding a civilian's perspective of the kind of travel is really important in your worldview, your view in America, and history in general.
In the very same way that if somebody visits the United States and they bounced from New York City to Los Angeles down to Miami and then left, they're going to have a completely and totally unrealistic viewpoint of what the United States is and what U.S. culture is in the same way. Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say to your point that this is, I think I may have messaged you this and said this, but this is a time of conservation, in my opinion, and conservation of these principles that we're talking about here. Like, this is not a time for more liberalism insofar as not like the classical liberal idea of free speech. Like, that's a classically liberal idea. I'm saying conserving those values, like, specifically. It's not a time to open up, more egalitarianism in all these very obscure places. Like, that's not going to solve any problems, and it doesn't serve the majority of people. I think for the majority of my adulthood, and if you guys disagree with this, there's always been this tyranny of the minority for such a long time that we've lost the plot on what's good for the whole, rather than just these small niche groups. And that's why traditionally, like, the Democrat Party has existed to represent the interests of smaller groups of people. I think, representative throughout history, what they meant to represent. And we've kind of gotten away from that. Like there needs to be a conservation of the first principles and founding principles of this country and getting back to them. Like that, I think, is sort of that answer, coupled obviously with like education, and this whole notion, like you said, like life is not coffee outside in the Palazzo Vecchio. Like that's just not life. That's a curated experience for you, and it doesn't need to be, brutish and short either, right? It doesn't have to be, the experience in the middle of Kenya getting your arms cut off like that, to understand these things. It takes a very basic level of effort to go and get involved in whatever it is that holds up the life around you. If that is going to your school board and understanding who is there for your children and making these decisions, or whatever, the county superintendent, like who is this person? Who's funding this person? All of these things, like that's what it requires. And it's, we have friends who've done that, and they've been on the show and talked about just really the barrier to entry into understanding all that stuff is not as difficult as most people would think it is. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is do you think that the sort of like, I guess, like ideological capture we see here in the United States today is sort of in-state U.S. empire? Or do you think that this is because of something like the internet, and that most people, or at least what the people see online, is not an actual representation of everybody in the United States? Does that not make sense?
Yeah, can you rephrase it, please?
Yeah, no worries. What I'm saying is this, most of the doom and gloom online, it's when you go on there, that it just seems like that's it. That's everything. It's all negative. And I think that when people go online, they get really disaffected and depressed. And, they think that this is somehow they can't separate the internet from real life. And maybe it dissuades them from getting involved locally or whatever. Do you think that this is part of the death of, the U.S. is just the fact that the internet is killing discourse and killing the ability to think critically? Or do you think that whatever is going on online is not actual, doesn't represent the whole of the American citizen base? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I'm pretty doom and gloom, but I try and hold on to optimism because I do believe that the human spirit is very strong, and I believe that we are good in community. And so I like to think that what is going on online is not a representation of America. And from my personal experience, that's the case. I am very involved in the community and have been, and it just never reflects what I see online. Yes, I'm a content creator. One of my biggest issues is I'm rarely online, which is really hard because I'm missing like major news stories often, or like I'm losing my ability to, come up with new ideas and stuff like that. It's a delicate balance, but I think online is a dangerous place and tends towards negativity. And so it makes people think that America is worse than it actually is. That being said, I do think there are some huge issues with America going on right now that do need to be taken into consideration. The issue is that because we're always online, we're chronically online, our emotions are what's controlling us. And then we're exhausted at the end of the day because we're constantly, in fight or flight from sitting on our phone and just being triggered continually. And so then we're not getting involved in our society. And so my hope is that we start to recognize that online discourse is not representative of the average American person. And we start to disengage from online and instead step out into the community. The internet, like I said, and social media is still relatively new. It's novel and it's very addictive. So maybe we're just going through a cycle of humanity where we, get addicted to something and we get really stuck on it. And then we're like, oh, this is not the move. And we go back outside. And part of me wants to hope, or really wishes, that AI is going to be part of the reason why that happens. Because once everything online is just AI slop, we're not going to want to go online anymore. It's like we can't even do anything. So I'm like, well, maybe AI actually isn't the downfall. Maybe it's going to push us outside because we realize everything online is a curated BS. That's my hope. What I fear is that people in positions of power are going to manipulate and control the situation where we still believe online is the actual representation of what America is, or blocks us from getting involved in our community, or blocks us from, I don't know, learning, understanding our cognitive biases, understanding what critical thinking actually is, and all of that. It's kind of a roundabout answer because I hit on so many points, but hopefully I answered it still.
No, you're good, because I actually have had the same thought about that. Maybe this will be the catalyst for getting everybody off the internet, is realizing just how bad it all is. I do think that people are dopamine addicted, and that the short form content nonsense that you see, the TikTok dance reels and all that crap like that has people totally captured in a very, very different way than the people that enjoy the doom and gloom political geopolitics crap online. But one of the things I think about is, like you said, people have to get off the internet, and they have to go outside, and they have to, or get involved with other people, and maybe that'll be the catalyst for it, I guess. But I guess I have this fear that people will be convinced over and over again that they have to exist there, and that there is an actual mechanism to keep people there with the digitalization of everything, and that there's actual forces working against you to get off the computer or get off your phone. I think that that's a goal of the greater they, and it's a very vague thing to say, they, but I do think that that's a goal. And it requires people to, I think, sort of come to that conclusion that there is an incentive for all of these people, whether it's business, for ad revenue, or whatever else, to get you to stay online, that you have to make the conscious decision to just walk away. Sort of like we were talking about walking away from content creators that are just there for engagement farming, I don't know. I think that is an actual problem, is not just the incentivizing of keeping you online, but almost the requirement for you to be online, I guess, in some way, shape, or form.
I think there's going to be a generational swing to it as well, because you look at the boomers, right? My mother-in-law shared with me a Facebook post once, and it said, "Let's see how many likes Jesus Christ can get," and it was Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they just, and I share that because it is somewhat humorous, but also to the level of the way that that the boomers see the internet and what it is, is the idea of like, did you know that you can order pizza on this thing, holding up the smartphone. And then millennials, like, we were young teenagers when the iPhone hit and when smartphones became a thing, and then social media became ubiquitous. So for us, the drug, as you describe it, was introduced as we were coming of age. And then we developed like with it. It wasn't there, and then suddenly it was. Whereas like Gen Z and Gen Alpha are growing up in a world where they have only known social media and the internet, and they navigate it completely and totally differently than millennials do, to the point where your Gen Z and your Gen Alpha, I'm going to call them kids, but wow, yeah, kids, I guess, whatever, like, they look at the world and they automatically assume and see everything as AI. They can see through it and interpret it because they've been reading it their entire lives, versus like millennials, we're still trying to catch up with the fact that AI developed underneath of us and don't really conceptually, it's running away faster than we can understand what the internet is, because it got handed to us when we were like young teenagers, if that makes sense. So generationally, as this thing swings as well, I see there being a walking away from social media kind of in the same manner that millennials kind of walked away from smoking. Like, that happened in our lifetime too. Remember, where it's like, oh, we don't have cigarettes indoors anymore. And then like, just boom, smoking just fell off to the wayside. So I'm optimistic. And we also know, depending on the source where you check, that anywhere between 30% to 60% of the traffic online is non-human. Like we know that and we can see it, But again, back to the generational gap that I was talking about, millennials will still sit there and argue with a bot in the comment section, whereas like Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they just won't even largely have any interaction with it because they know and they see through it what it is. And so you're just not really seeing their traffic online because of it. So I'm optimistic because of those things. I think generationally it's going to die off.
I think that Gen Z and Gen Alpha don't take it seriously. Millennials take it seriously. I think more millennials take online as real life. I think that the older you get, that the like boomers and Gen X, like they see it as a necessary but a necessary but unfortunate thing that they have to participate in. And I think the Gen X and or Gen Z and Gen Alpha get that this is just something to do, and it's the internet. It's fun. It's not serious. I'll go online and troll. Like that's just become it. It's why I think it's more, they're easily separated from it, I guess, in a way, but it also has, I guess, warped their brain too, in a way, for them to misinterpret real life for the internet. And almost like this concept of being a troll online has become taking your life not very seriously, which is why if you look at a lot of the Gen Z content creators, and that's who they are. Like it's kind of hard to get away from that. And even teachers will tell you the same thing. We've had conversations with them too, where they're actually concerned about the students that come in because they can't pay attention. Nothing is taken seriously in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's a problem. Like whatever you're talking about, how people will get off the internet, I think that we're still probably like generations probably away from that, and understanding that there's going to have to be like this recognition that the generation before me, like what they were doing and who they became because of this is so bad that I don't want to be that way. And I think that it's kind of happening because there's this like romanticization of like a past life with all of this content creation about farming and like being a homemaker and all this stuff. And it's like very, very performative, I think, as well. It's much in the same way. There is a resurgence of some of that stuff with some people, but I think too that it's like, they see it as a solution, sort of in the same way that when somebody feels like something's missing from their life, they just keep chasing the next thing, thinking it'll fill that hole for them, and then it really like never does. I just don't think like real solutions exist on the internet is kind of the point I'm trying to get here. And I think that, participating in your life, having a family, participating in whatever civic is going on around you, having a job, all of that stuff like that, that is real life. Tangible things in front of you is the prescription for dealing with a lot of these problems. And I think that when you have to participate in those things and you're tangibly involved, that you have skin in the game, that you actually you have to care about outcomes. And there's too many people that don't care about outcomes. They just care about what they're contributing to this massive Jackson Pollock painting that's going on online that makes no freaking sense to most people, Sorry, Jackson Pollock. But you said earlier that you feel like there's a bunch of problems that are affecting the United States right now. And I have an opinion on what I think is the problems that are affecting the United States right now. I'm kind of curious what your perspective of those problems are outside of this inability to communicate and the inability to interpret things or recognize where you're being propagandized, sort of what we've been talking about. Like, where do you see those problems are?
Well, I think there's a huge problem with immigration right now. I think people are really debating over how America should handle immigration. I think a lot of people agreed with the Trump administration on, general deportations and all of that. And then were very upset with how Trump went about handling those deportations, and also with his actual record, which is terrible. He has barely deported anyone. And so people are upset that he isn't following through with what he said he would, but also the way in which he's doing it is incredibly controversial. It's very polarizing. It's very us versus them. I'm talking about this in the future. There's going to be an article out about this, but the way also the administration has used propaganda to support DHS, or DHS has used propaganda to get people to support their policies and stuff, is fascinating. And in my opinion, problematic, because I'm not a fan of propaganda, and they've used it with AI. And so I think immigration is a huge one that needs to be discussed. And I think the average American is totally open to having a normal conversation about whether people should or shouldn't be deported. The average American's not like, we need open borders. And the average American's not like, deport no one, right? Mm-hmm. So there are people that are willing to have a middle ground, but I just think that what's going on in the general online and media and then the politicians is getting a lot of people upset about it, especially what was happening with Minnesota. And then you had the pushback from the Democrats and how it was portrayed in the media and all of that, just in the protests.
I agree with you. I think the propaganda piece of it and the way they went about advertising it was almost like too on the nose. Like, yes, there's this appeal for a America of yesteryear, and then it was like, this is all 1940s, 1950s style propaganda, and it was created by AI, and it was like it appealed to a very specific group of people, but to a lot of us, you included, it was just like, wow, that's just so blatantly propaganda. It actually. We now know that stuff back then was propaganda. You're now mimicking it, like versus like back then it was at least new. You know what I mean? Like this style of propaganda. I was going to ask you. I agree with you that immigration is a problem. Do you think that it's a problem mostly because of the like economic burden, or do you see it as more of like a cultural dilution problem?
I don't know if I see it as a problem in either of those cases, because
okay.
So when I archived all these videos, but I did a whole thing on immigration on Instagram. And the reason why I archived them is because it is so incredibly complex. Putting it in a 3-minute video is just close to impossible. I also found that the statistics, the information, the data out there is abysmal. It's really hard to find good data. And no matter which way you look, you can find data to support whatever argument you want to make. So I was like, okay, so I'm not even able to properly discuss whether immigration from an economic standpoint is beneficial or not for America. But I did find this one study, and I can't remember, I can give it to you guys later, but I thought it was a very thorough study, and it had good data, and it had a lean, but it was very open to talking about the flaws. And from what I've found, economically, it doesn't seem immigration is a huge problem. It actually seems it's very beneficial, and that the average immigrant actually adds more money to the economy when compared to the average American. The average American actually relies on the government more than an average immigrant. Now, of course, we have the high skill level immigrants that are really pulling up that average, in Silicon Valley and such. And I think that's where it's really pulling that average. But I think that this idea that immigrants are just like a net suck to the economy, which is being pushed by the Trump administration, is just not really accurate. And I also don't really know if immigration is negatively affecting our demographics or population, so long as they aren't being targeted by political parties to hold on to specific beliefs that are counterintuitive to, or that counter the American belief system. So, for example, I think Democrats really target immigrants on trying to get them to be as non-assimilation as possible. And I think that it has to do with just focusing on smaller minority groups. And I think that's a huge way that they try and pull votes. You then have the Republicans that try to essentially act like almost every immigrant is, hurting the general demographic or is against the American Constitution or the Founding Fathers or whatever. I think both are just overgeneralization of what's actually going on, and they're essentially just trying to target specific groups of people so that they can increase their votes. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, and what I want is just a conversation of how much it's affecting our demographics, how to make sure that immigrants can still feel connected to their culture that they're coming from, but it's not necessarily conflicting with American culture. And when I say American culture, I mean like the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, classical liberal principles, all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But also discuss how economically, I don't even know where I was going with that. I'll just end it on there. What I want is more of a nuanced discussion about all of this rather than these wholesale arguments that are very divisive and on one side or the other.
I actually think that the point about like assimilation, I want to touch on real quick, because I think that there has been a culture established here in the United States with Americans in general about not liking our culture or our history. I think that's a truth. And I think that a lot of the immigrants that have moved in, and when I say immigrants, I want to be very specific. There's a difference between a lot of people that have just run across the border over the past 6 years and the people actually going through the immigration process, right? And I do know people like that. Like one of my good friends, his wife is a Japanese immigrant and she's now a citizen. Like I'm not talking about her specifically, but I think that this culture of hating the U.S. is pervasive here in the United States. And I think that what that has done, and a large swath of people who immigrate here, is almost created this permission to not be a part of the melting pot, as it were, that I don't have to assimilate here anymore. You know, this concept of America being all of these cultures where, you know, we're this melting pot of all of these different systems, and you can still be proud of your heritage and all of this stuff, but, you know, we have but one flag, as Teddy Roosevelt said, is evaporating, in my opinion. And I think that is because of the already present culture here in the United States. I don't think it's something that's being brought or imported here from outside the US. Like that's already happening here. And so it's just a continuation of it. And then because like people like us grew up here, we have American culture. Like that's who we are. Like American culture. There's no other culture other than like what we've experienced from like military service or traveling, and your experience with your dad and his business. The people coming here from, you know, wherever, Somalia or Syria or wherever they're coming here from, you know, their culture and what they grew up on is coming with them, and there's no need to assimilate because it's almost like, well, you guys don't even like it here. Why? And you're telling me this culture isn't good, so I'm not even going to try, I guess. So it's like, it's not even necessarily that it's the fault of the people coming in. It's the people that already live here as well who have created this culture where it's just like, yeah, dude, this place sucks. Yeah, I guess it's better than where I came from, but yeah, this place sucks. You know, that's how I sort of view it. It's a two-pronged thing, I suppose.
So yeah, I do get what you're saying. I will say I can understand your point. I'm not going to disagree with it or agree with it, actually, because I don't think I have enough lived experience to really answer or really address that specific part. I do believe that there is a general self-hatred in America that is very pervasive in academia that I find very problematic. So I could totally see how that would affect new coming immigrants. I just haven't spent enough time looking into that to know what's going on.
Let me be more specific. I don't mean to prescribe every immigrant that way, and I'll give you another example. Oh, yeah. There's a group of people here where I live in California. A lot of them are from Eastern Europe, and they've left because of what's going on over there right now, like Ukrainians, Belarusians, you know, people like that. And I've just gotten the chance to know them because their children go to the same school my kid goes to. And I've had the opportunity to talk to these parents and other people who work now around where I work. And most of them are extremely glad to be here and will 100% don't understand what's going on with this like self-hatred. And I'll give you an example from somebody. There's a person I work with who is from Southwest Asia, and I won't say like where he's from, but when Charlie Kirk died, the man was crying in our office, and I was like, yo, that's to me. And I said something to Chris because like obviously like we talked about that when it happened, but like his day was ruined. Like, I mean, he loved Charlie Kirk and was like, this was somebody who he immigrated here as an adult, came to found Charlie Kirk's like content and like really agree with him and thought he represented all these like great things about the US. And then obviously that was all destroyed essentially when he was murdered. Okay. And so like that person, I would not say is a part of this culture of, well, I don't have to assimilate because you hate it here too, you know? I just think that sentiment exists because mostly because Americans have this self-deprecating way of going about their lives now, that it creates this environment where it's conducive. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and I can totally see that. And I didn't mean to imply that you were, you know, insinuating any specific thing.
I don't think you were.
Okay, good. But yeah, I can see that definitely happening. Like I said, I mean, I live in Tennessee. there's not much going on here. I'm not really
True.
near
And
the
I'm in
border.
California, totally different experience.
Exactly. Like I lived in California for 5 years, so I have some experience with that, but that was 6-7 years ago. So I don't have a ton of experience with large populations of immigrants. We do have that in Tennessee, obviously, but we don't have a lot like coming in right now. Also, it's relatively separated. It's very different groups and areas. There's not as much as I guess cohesion that you'd experience more on, or what I experienced on the West Coast. I lived in Seattle and California or LA for a while, so it's just kind of a different demographic over here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Would you say that immigrating to the United States is more of a right or a privilege? I'm interested.
Privilege. I think immigration in general is a privilege. I don't think it's a right. I mean, I don't believe in open borders. So I think people who would believe in open borders would say that it's a right because you have the right to move wherever you want. I don't think open borders are possible in any shape or form. And I've looked into it because I genuinely want to understand where that argument is coming from. I just genuinely don't think that's possible. And so I think it would be a privilege, not a right. I think, yeah.
And then kind of a follow-on question to that is, if it is indeed a privilege, how do you feel about the United States then basically picking and choosing who is allowed to immigrate and who is not? Because that seems to be one of the lines of reason, right, for open borders is it's like, well, if you're going to let in, then you have to let in. And it's like, well, I give my opinion first, so you know where I'm coming from on this. I don't think that it should be any type of controversy that a country chooses net positive citizens to bring into its country while excluding, right, possible immigrants that you'd be like, I don't think that they're going to assimilate, or I don't think that they're going to bring positive outcomes.
It's like hiring practices, essentially.
That's exactly how I would see it, as hiring practices. But I'd be interested to kind of get your take on it.
So I agree with you, actually. I would have no issue with that. The big concern, though, is that once you politicize these things, what happens? If we could all just sit down and have a conversation about the nuance of the situation and how maybe having immigrants from locations that have high percentages of terrorists might not be the smartest move, or maybe we need to vet individuals significantly because we live in a globalized world and we need to really make sure that we are not having individuals that might harm America coming in through the borders. I feel like we just sit down and have a conversation about that. But once politicians start making it based on race or religion or any of those trigger, rage bait things that get the people riled up and get the engagement going, gets the votes going, all of that, then we devolve into these baseless arguments that get us absolutely nowhere. And that's where, when it comes to kind of immigration in general, where I get frustrated, is it just seems that a lot of the politicians are just looking for short taglines that they can repeat over and over again to get people to vote, or tribalistic tendencies, rather than talking about, like, logically and rationally, let's have a conversation about, like, what we want to do with the borders, what we want to do with immigration, the pros and cons, and not have to connect it to identity politics or, whatnot every single time.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate your pragmatism, by the way.
Thank you.
It's very refreshing.
I try.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. This is a problem I think about all the time. Is literally everything is viewed from a political sense. Even sports now, for some reason, is politicized. I think it's like people's brains are trained that way. What would the prescription be for getting people to stop politicizing stuff? Like literally everything is politicized. From whatever it is, all of it is.
Something that I wanted to mention earlier on that I think we need to really get back to is humility and empathy, but like appropriate empathy, not like the kind of empathy that's just like surface level, actual appropriate empathy and humility. I believe we have lost basic virtues that make us connect as a community. And maybe it is because of online discourse. It's a lot easier to hate someone you've never met in person. But I think focusing on values and virtues and our character is probably one of the best ways to move forward with having these kinds of conversations and not seeing the person as an adversary. it's kind of funny because I see this as like, it's like a relationship. Okay. When you get into an argument with your significant other, or you have a disagreement with your significant other, the healthy way to look at it is it's you two on a team and the disagreement is the mountain you have to climb, or that's the problem you have to conquer together. That is how we should see everything in America. Like, that's how we should look at it. We are on the same team, right? Yeah. We shouldn't be seeing it as adversaries constantly trying to tear the other person down and destroy the other person. The average American does not want that. They really don't, even if they might disagree on what some people would consider to be human rights. Just talk about where those human rights come from. Talk about why they have those beliefs. You'll recognize and you'll understand that those people are not evil. They're not trying to take anything away from you. It's just very different philosophical backgrounds. Mm-hmm. But once you see someone as not evil, then I feel like you can have a conversation at the table. You can sit down and have a conversation and actually try and find a solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did a reel on this actually, talking about the difference between agonism and antagonism, and it's exactly what you're talking about, and not seeing each other as enemies. I actually just kind of lost my train of thought a little bit, but on that whole point, I hate when that happens, dude. It's very annoying. Yeah, constantly. American people are traditionally confrontational with one another, and I think that there's this misnomer that we're not, and then it's just like, that I guess that this is the land of where you can come and everything is going to be better, and it is better in a lot of ways, but like we forget that we are a politically active and politically violent group of people, and it's just like the way that it is. I mean, there's been plenty of assassinations, not just of presidents, but of other political leaders, and a lot of violence done to one another, and I think that just like it's just another outlet. The internet is another outlet to wage that sort of aggression out on one another, and the information warfare is now just a more modern technique in that battle space. You were talking about wanting to be that person that is objective, and you want to be that person that introduces a way, not just of presenting a way to think, but a way of how to think. You know what I mean? And if you do these like polls online, like you asked about the free speech thing and people not understanding, or you're concerned with people not understanding that what's going on now can change. And then now you're in the out group eventually. I guess, what would you say to people who are looking for an actual way to communicate to somebody that they would traditionally not communicate with? Like, what advice would you give them to introduce having a conversation that's going to be beneficial? Like, is there a conversational technique? Is there a way of thinking and approaching somebody? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I actually think one of the best ways to approach these kinds of conversations is to come from a position of curiosity, rather than accusation or assumption or, anything like that. Curiosity, because you actually want to learn about the other person. And that actually comes from respect. I grant every single human being on this planet respect at default. I do. I think that's a good way to live. And that doesn't mean that automatically I trust them. It doesn't mean that, they get certain perks or privileges with me. That not at all. It's respect because they're an individual human being that deserves to be treated as such and respectfully in the right way, not being mean to them or whatever, or making negative assumptions. And so I think, coming towards someone in a conversation with that respect, with that curiosity, is a great way to get people to lower their barriers. And rather than feel like they have to defend something, they can actually talk about why they believe what they believe. And then you actually might be able to change their opinion because they're being seen as an individual and as a human in your eyes. At the end of the day, we are relational people or entities, whatever, people. We want relationships, we want community, we want to be seen, and we don't like being shut down. We don't like being, viewed in a negative light. And so if you just come into a conversation already viewing someone negatively, then of course they're gonna shut down and they're just gonna defend their position. There's no reason they're gonna want to change their mind. So that's how I would. And I'm a very curious individual. Like, I just really like to understand people, ideas, beliefs, all of that. So this almost feels like default for me. But I think that for most people, that's probably not the case. And I think we live in a society that doesn't encourage that. So it's further instilled in our brains not to be that way. But I think if you continue to kind of generate curiosity in the way you're thinking in everyday life, that over time you can default to that when talking to other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I like your approach there. I actually was going to go back to what you said about values, and you talked about like humility and where would you source those values? I guess, I think that we don't even agree on that anymore. I've seen even attacks on Enlightenment principles now from a lot of people. And by that, a lot of them are ad hominem, like talking about who, some of these people from the Enlightenment era are as individuals, like, attacking John Locke for something bad he did in his personal life, or talking about, them as the errored human beings and not the actual concepts they were presenting, So where would you source these morals and ethics that you're talking about that people have sort of gotten away from for them to internalize and then to operate on those principles? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, there has to be a source for those things, and it has to be agreed upon, and it used to be, and I don't think we agree on that source anymore. Like, where would you source those?
Yeah, so that's kind of part of what I was insinuating earlier when I mentioned that, is that we don't have a source. We don't have values anymore. And I actually was trying to cover this in my most recent video on the Declaration of Independence, but didn't have as much time, and it's so dense. But I was considering writing an article about it. Essentially, for me, I am Christian, so my values are based on Christianity.
Same.
I also think it is advantageous for the country to base their principles on Christianity as well. That does not mean I'm supportive of a Christian national identity. That doesn't mean that I think that Christianity should be the religion of the country. I still support the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and all of that. But we do need a set of ideals. I think if we look at the history of Christianity and the kind of what has come of Christianity or come out of Christianity, it's been positive overall. It has been positive, and they have great values. Something that I've noticed lately is I've talked to a few agnostic individuals who they say, I don't believe in God. I don't really believe in God. There might be something out there, not Christian, not Catholic, whatever. But I've read the Bible, and I actually totally agree with the principles of the Bible. And I do think that our country should be based on those principles. I really believe that we need to get back to that. But the only way for that to happen is to allow people to accept the concept of Christianity, the principles of Christianity, and being okay with them not taking that next step and believing in God. But it doesn't seem like we have a society that's okay with it, because I would say a lot of what you see online, especially in the political realm, the idea is that to be Christian, you must also, I need to make sure I'm phrasing this properly. It seems that there is no gray area. You either are Christian or you are not. But can we leave room for people to comfortably agree with Christian principles, but maybe not make that final step to becoming a Christian? Can we allow that to happen? I think we should allow that to happen. I think it would benefit our country. I just don't think that politically a lot of people are okay with it or wanting that. And I think that's a flaw. That's a problem.
I think, again, people have to be willing to separate themselves from their personal religion, and understanding that this is a country is really just what it boils down to. Because I agree with you. I don't believe in Christian nationalism as a model for government at all. Because, again, to this argument before, a bunch of people who are Muslims could get in charge of the government, and then now that changes because they have a majority, and now we're, a Muslim nation or whatever. Like, these things can always change if we're basing them on laws. Yes, I think that that's kind of what has to happen, to your point. Like, you have to be willing to accept that people have to be willing to accept that you see these traditional Christian values, love your neighbor, things like that. To use a very simple example, and there's a totally different definition of what love is, I guess, in the Bible versus what people may interpret. But yeah, you have to be okay with that. And you have to understand that you can't take what you believe religiously and imprint that on other people and expect that from them and then create an outgroup because of it. It doesn't and then turn that into some sort of like legislative weapon. Like, that can't be the reality. And I think too, there's this problem now I see online that's coming up where there's this wanting to separate Christians from people who are, to take this like geopolitically, like, You can't be Christian if you don't hate Israel, or if you hate Israel, or whatever. There's like this group of people now too, and I think I mentioned to you this before, but there's a conflation of like Christianity, and then like you get all this stupid iconography online about like Hitler and the SS. It's like those two things don't jive, but there's a lot of revisionist history going on with it. Now, you don't necessarily, I guess the point I'm trying to make is like, you don't own this. Like, this is still a country. Like, you have to be okay with and make room for other people. And I'm just like kind of repeating your point, but yeah, I agree. That's what has to happen.
I think when you made your point on Christian nationalism, it makes me kind of chuckle, because the idea of saying like you have to be a Christian to vote or to be in government, like Christians can't even agree on what it means to be Christian, and haven't been able to for 1,500 years. So to the people that are pushing that, you're not being very logically serious. However, and by the way, the founding fathers, like some of the colonies were Catholic, or at least one was. Many of them were Protestant, right? So they had to hash those differences out, and at least a few of them were agnostic that were in there, at least a couple.
Oh yeah,
right. They had to hash this out too. But also, that being the case, and I'm trying to be a little bit funny, but that being the case, I still think that it's important, and piggybacking on what you said earlier, Brandon, about understanding what the United States is fundamentally, and getting back to that first principles, in order to be an American. I don't think that it's too far to say that you need to be able to recognize these principles that are based on the biblical tradition, because this is where our American principles of freedom and liberty come from. Like you
even just a historical timeline, you know what I mean? Even
exactly.
On the very basis of that alone.
Exactly. If you cannot reconcile those or say that you agree with those, well, now we need to have a conversation about whether or not, like, you agree with what America is as a principle. You know what I'm saying? Doesn't mean you have to praise Jesus or give your life to God, but you need to recognize that these principles that we have in America come from biblical principles.
Mm-hmm.
This is where our morals and our ethics, they're founded in.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the truth.
And I tend to overly criticize the side I'm on, because I get very disappointed when they don't do what I think they should do. So generally, when I criticize, my frustration here is, I agree with what you're saying, but a lot of the people that are in a position to make that happen, or are Christian, aren't actually doing that, and are making it so much worse. Because when you are trying to push a religion down somebody's throat, and you are not separating, like I mentioned Jefferson in my video, and I said he's a deist, but he wasn't, Protestant. He didn't believe in a provincial God. And so I wanted to point out that they were different. He was okay stepping back and allowing for that difference to move forward, because he wanted it to reflect the American mind, and he wanted to reflect the American people and stuff. And so people need to really start stepping back and recognizing that the American people, representing the American people, doesn't necessarily mean forcing a religion down someone's throat. And I want to harken back to allowing people to have room to agree with Christian principles while not actually being Christian is, I think, like where this all needs to go. But if you don't let that happen, people are just going to completely reject Christianity and anything related to Christianity, which is the foundation of America. And so you're actually shooting yourself in the own damn foot when you're doing that. And so so what are you actually trying to do here when you're doing this? Are you actually trying to help America? Are you actually trying to help Christianity? Or what are you trying? I'm confused. Or maybe you just like completely miss that people automatically are going to dig their heels in and go the opposite direction when you try force their hand. It's just not going to work.
I think people have to realize that you can't separate the U.S. from that at all. As much as you want to try to and revise the U.S.'s history, you just can't. Even the Enlightenment thinkers that our founders were basing some of these things on rooted a lot of what they believed and wrote about in Christianity. Like even writing about how Christian models were the perfect system of models, or the best system of models that you could, or model for values that you had available to you. Like this is actual verbiage that they used. You just can't separate those things. I think people think that you can. And I think too, that because of the certain individuals that you're talking about, and not just recently, but throughout time, that they have a problem with it. And it's interesting too, Chris, like you talked about before, like even Christ himself wants you to choose this. Like it's not, mandatory. It's mandatory for certain things, but it's still a choice that you have to make. And people trying to mandate Christianity, from a Christian nationalist political movement standpoint, like that's anti-Christian anyway. You know what I mean? Like that's not, you have a choice, period. But anyway, you can't separate these things. And we all have to agree on that. You can't separate America from its founding. You can't separate the fact that these principles were the guiding principles for the people of the time and have been for a very long time. And it just boils down to this point that we're all making here about morality and ethics, and how much the United States has lost its way morally and ethically for a lot of reasons. And unfortunately, the imperfections of people, and then a lot of the atrocities that have happened underneath the United States, people look at those and say, well, then this system itself needs to be thrown away and it's no longer good, when that's not necessarily the truth. It kind of goes back to this stupid fallacy that, I can have everything now, and if you're not going to give me everything now, then it's bad, with politicians. Like you have to accept that you can't separate these things and move forward. There's just really no other way about it. And if you do, and you think that you're going to lift the U.S. off of those principles and go another direction somewhere else, where are we sourcing these concepts of morals and ethics from? Because now there's nothing holding it up anymore. It's not going to float on its own. It's crazy too, because a lot of these things we all probably would agree on, when it comes traditional values wise, like you were talking about, like respecting one another, having humility. Like these are all things that the Bible talks about. It's just, there's no possible way to do that without collapsing all of this in on itself. You can't point at something else and say, well, this is also all of those principles without God. Like you just have to, like you said, make room for the fact that people want to embody those principles, but they don't necessarily want to participate religiously. I think that's the best way to put it. Like you, Carolyn, like saying that. I don't know another way to frame that,
Well, you can't separate one from the other, because to remove God from it removes. Well, that's where you got those notions of mercy and love and acceptance, and like that's where they come from. Without the God of Christianity, you don't have it. And Carolyn, I believe it was the same video that you referenced earlier, to this point that you're making, Brandon, that the Declaration of Independence references God 4 times, but only one of those, see how much I paid attention to your video, only one of those times was actually written by Jefferson himself. The other 3 were edited in by the founding fathers, and Jefferson, being one of the deists of the group and looking across the way, didn't push back on those edits and accepted them and voted off on them as well, right? Did I get all that correct?
You did. Great retention.
That's hard for us. It really is. My brain doesn't work with me most of the time. I'm a much better writer than I am speaker, so I hopefully haven't sounded retarded on here talking to you.
You sounded great so far. I'm like, man, I hope
that.
I'm not just rambling over here and they understand what I'm saying.
You're not. It's funny. I've been thinking this whole time is like these conversations with people, like I've learned listening to you in this conversation how much we actually agree with one another, and like you have some of the same thought process that Chris and I have when we talk privately, and even some of the things you've said have been like thoughts I've had privately as well about this, because I do care, and I think you care about outcomes as well. You care about the United States and the outcome we're going to have. I do too, because I think about my kids very, very often about what sort of world they're going to inherit. And that's a point I make, like when Chris and I talk, like from like a father standpoint about this kind of stuff. I worry because I have no idea. We even had this conversation the other day where I was like, I have no clue what to prep my sons for anymore because the world is changing so fast. You know, somebody in the 60s could pretty well prep their children to be adults in the 70s. Like, artificial intelligence is going to change literally everything, and it's nothing anybody has ever seen before. I have no idea what to tell them, you know, like other than be open and learn and adapt. Like that's it. Like you have to be the most adaptable person ever. And unfortunately, I think tech moves so fast that the human brain can't keep up with how much they have to adapt. I think that's another stress point as well for so many people, is feeling like you're constantly behind with all these really crazy changes. But I think the way to like sum all this up is to say is like, you have to have something inside of you as a guiding principles. Otherwise you can't make heads or tails of anything going on externally. And I think so many people here in the country have a lot of internal strife. And I think that has a lot to do with how good our society is. I think it is a symptom of a society that has it so well. And that I had this conversation actually with Matthew Pajot, who his brother is a little bit more famous than him. He's probably would hate me saying that. But he's amazing, super awesome philosopher. Him and his brother are fantastic. But he was making this point on the show we did about toiling. And this was just like this constant theme he had about life is meant to be experienced and toiled. And that's where you learn the principles of the Bible specifically, is through the laborious practice of life. And he was doing a way better job describing this stuff than I am going to. But we don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to be that person who wakes up and just goes to work every morning, you know, and or like laborious work every morning. It's not the same. You know, we have so many things that you can do now that we take for granted. You know, you go on a deployment for 6 months and think about how much you miss door dashing. I've literally heard people complain about that. You know, it's like, did you not think that this was going to happen out here in the middle of nowhere, Africa? You know, you weren't going to be able to do this, you know, but like, that's just how entitled we all are. And I think that's why I think we've created a society that lets you want for almost nothing, that you don't appreciate the fact that that was all made for you from people who did have to labor. And these principles we're talking about were the why they got up and did those things and took care of one another. Like it's almost just like this natural veneer over the top of the past, you know, and this romanticization online of like an old way of life, it's performative. And I mean that to say is like, you think that that's just going through motions, you know, you're collecting eggs from your chickens, you know, like that somehow is meaning. It's like, well, no, like that way of life actually was tied to an entire set of morals and principles and necessity as well. You know, like you can't just go through the motions and then get the lesson. You know what I'm saying? Like that's the problem with this, you know, veneer and the performativeness of like the simple life we see online. Like this was a way of life, and that is to say that way of life involved the moralities and the ethics of that too. You know, you can't have this like modern lack of that stuff and then just go through the motions with raising chickens in your front yard and somehow walk away with the lesson. Like that's just not how it works, I guess. Does that make any sort of sense? So
yeah, and the fact that a lot of people are turning it into an online social media genre, right? Because it's the homesteading community.
Trad wife.
Trad wife, right.
Only drives another nail in your point, to where it's like you're if that's the point for you to turn it into social media clout, that you're out here homesteading and gaining a social media following off of it, I think you're missing the larger point of homesteading in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's exactly. It just shows to show you like how fake everything really is, I suppose. And then too, just how much you can turn a homesteading lifestyle into a luxury, right? Like I don't think anybody homesteading in the 1850s would talk to you about luxury. That's just, it's a total American thing. You know what I mean? Like there are people that I met in Africa who are homesteading because they have to, and meanwhile they live around every venomous snake ever in the world, and wild animals. It's just absolute. It's,
you mean building my
life.
House and feeding my kids?
Yeah, life. But that's what I'm getting at, man, is I think that's what this is. I often wonder, did the Romans realize that they were falling apart morally and ethically too, the same way like we can? I think that like the online community gives us this notion because you are interpreting that and ingesting it all the time. But I just wonder, like, is it? Because there are populist movements in Rome too. I think of the Gracchi brothers who were both murdered. Like there was a massive populist movement with them. It seems like everything goes in cycles, that people lose their way because they end up having it too nice, and there's always going to be somebody there to blame a group on the other end and say that's the problem and here's the solution. It's why we collectivize as people. It's why you have all these content creators like Candace Owens and Ian Carroll and Nick Fuentes who are very quick to jump on a specific bandwagon and blame Jews in general. Like if you want to have a problem with foreign policy, that's cool, but that's not really what you're saying at all. There's an implication here that they all run away from the second you start asking them questions, even though they like to say that they're just asking questions. And we've experienced that with people as well, who will run immediately away from the things they're implying because they want others to just come to that conclusion without them giving them the conclusion. But I often wonder, like, were other people so self-aware of the degradation of their society the way that I don't know, we are, I suppose. There were obviously, there's Roman authors whose work we have today who recognize that, but I wonder if the traditional, regular, everyday Roman citizen going about their life thought the same thing along the Arno. Like, who knows? I don't know.
I mean, you could just say that there's really not much of a difference. Like,
that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, we have social media now. Yeah, we have tons of access to information and we can read all the books in the world and everything's at our fingertips and stuff. But, what's also at our fingertips is stupid, I don't know, AI generated vegetables talking or whatever. I don't know if you guys saw that online.
Oh, dude, I hate those videos. Yeah.
My sister sends me like these AI generated things of cats talking in like Chinese and like acting like
very
humans.
Popular now.
And I respond like, please stop sending these to me because you're affecting my algorithm. I don't want to watch this crap. Like, Please stop. But it's like, that's at our fingertips now too. So it's like, okay, yeah, we have access to more information, but we aren't taking it. So I would say like the average person is probably just as unaware of what's actually going on as, a Roman citizen. And then you actually add on top of that, we have way more propaganda being pushed into our faces all the time because of social media. Even when we think we're aware of what's going on, who's to say we actually know what's going on? Which is a whole nother mind trip that I struggle with personally, because I'm just like, sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I can even have an opinion because I don't know if I'm reading or learning what I should be or what's true or what somebody else wants me to be learning and reading. So I'm just like, I don't even know what is going on anymore.
Exactly.
There's one thing that I've really appreciated from having this conversation with you, and that is seeing another person that's able to objectively look at a situation, because we've talked about immigration, we've talked about first principles, we've talked about a lot, but look at a situation or look at an argument clinically without becoming immediately morally invested in one side or another. And I think that that's a skill that's become like archaic, right? Especially in the day and age where propaganda is the rule, not the exception. And one of the things that I try to point out to people all the time is it's like, if you want to know propaganda, one of the biggest red flags is it trying to emotionally draw you to slap the table right now and be completely and totally for or against something, black and white, you have to choose a side. Like, as soon as you see that, that is telltale propaganda, because it is aiming to influence your behavior, right?
Yeah.
Like, there you go. But if people we're able to, and again, this kind of goes back to my argument for education reform and teaching children how to reason again. If you take a look at a problem set and be able to look at it objectively first, and exactly, you've said it probably 3 or 4 times now, I don't know if I know enough to have an opinion, which is just a more educated way of saying I don't know, which turns out is perfectly fine. It is perfectly okay to say I don't know, and be that way until you gained enough data to go, okay, I've critically thought through it, and now my opinion is X or it's Y, right? But that starts with being able to clinically observe something and not be morally sucked into choosing a side from it with which that's going to be your paradigm in dealing with the problem.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, I agree. Well, first, thank you. And I agree with you. And I don't understand why it's so hard for people not to be objective sometimes. Like, I really don't get it. Like, I think maybe when I was younger in my early 20s, I think I was a lot more like easy to trigger and more emotional. You know, the prefrontal cortex was still developing, all that. But I think maybe I'm naturally contrarian. And so to me, I hate being told what to do. I hate being told how to believe or anything like that. So the second I even get a whiff of that shit, I'm like, literally get out of my face. And so, and a lot of people I think think they're like that. And so I'm like, okay, take another step and actually be like that. And I feel like the average people would say that, you know, Americans are generally a lot more cynical, and they're more used to questioning authority, and they hate the government more than the average, you know, other developed countries and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, I agree with that. So let's do that more often. Let's step up.
It's funny. This whole notion makes me think of the book I Am Legend, and how like you're actually the monster in the story, right? But you're now the only person trying to think things rationally through. And it sucks too, because like you try to be helpful and all of this, and you, like you said, you're like, am I reading something that's actually true? I think that all the time, which it can get exhausting in and of itself, because if you go and you read multiple sources for literally everything, you're going to be constantly reading online or whatever. It's just, it's hard to even be helpful because of the inundation of so much stuff. I don't know. I guess I know we're hitting like the 2-hour mark here, but I do think that the U.S. Constitution and our founding documents, there's nothing else on earth that's better than that right now. Like I don't believe that at all. I think, or that there is anything better than that. That is the truth. I don't think the CCP's, you know, version of communism with capitalism is better. I don't think so. There was an incident with a girl at a university recently who was approached to be a CCP mouthpiece and then was cyber stalked by the CCP. Oh yeah, go look that up. It's absolutely nuts. They tried to convince her to basically move from all of her regular social media to WeChat, which, if you know anything about WeChat, is literally a government spy device on your phone. Like, do you know what WeChat is, Carolyn?
I've heard of it, but I'm not surprised at what you're describing. Like I said, my dad, his business partners were from China. Or yeah. I actually might not have said that. Yeah, I did say that.
You did say
that.
So
I do know how China works, especially in the business world and all of that.
Well, WeChat is your entire life in one app. You can bank through WeChat, use social media through WeChat, you talk to your friends through WeChat. It's everything. It's an everything app, but it's literally just a government spy app on your phone. But for the CCP, which is why I won't download the White House app either. You're not going to get me. I'm not doing that. And actually, I'll tell you this offline, Carolyn, because of something I said to you earlier. Don't repeat. You know what I'm talking about. That person has told me a lot of stuff about the White House app. But anyway, no, there's nothing more. There is nothing closer to perfect than what we have here. And I think if people took the time to objectively read those documents and understand the intent behind them, and then try to understand that the people who wrote them were imperfect people, and the way that you can separate the art from the artist with the music you listen to or the movies you watch, look at those people, the founders, as just imperfect humans, and see what they were trying to do, and see that it's not something that you need to get to rewrite or redo. You know, those documents are okay the way they are. And guess what? We have the ability to amend those documents and have done so plenty of times throughout history. You know, that is a function of those documents, and it's a very good thing about them. It just, there's no need to reinvent the wheel if people spent the time to understand the people who wrote them and what those documents say, and understand that there was a very specific set of morals and ethics that came out of that period of time, and understand too that it may look a little different because of our modern age, but much of the oppression that those guys were fighting against exists today, and is really just like worse. The fact that corporations have First Amendment rights and all these other things like human beings do is wild to me. That needs to be completely and totally undone. The incentive structure itself has to be undone for us to even be on a level playing field anymore. And I think that, again, like the prescription for that is to go back and understand what your rights are as a human being and an American, and then understand that requires your participation in that, and that the government was never there to act in loco parentis for you. The government is for you. It says that, and the politicians are not celebrities, and they don't deserve your adoration. And as Chris likes to say, they're toilet paper. Use them and throw them away if they suck now and they're dirty. Like that's what you have to do. Just understand that you have to take responsibility for your life and separate your ego from your political opinions, and be willing to be wrong, and then also be willing to accept the source material for these morals and ethics, and then continue to not force your crap on other people. Like that's it. It's crazy. It's not hard. It's just hard it's not hard to talk about. I guess it's just hard to do, which is almost everything in life, I guess. But
well, yeah, everything that you're talking about, that is the price of liberty.
Yep. Correct. Anyway, Carolyn, it was fun to learn about you, actually. And just sort of like drives the point home for me that if we could do this podcast in person and had a conversation with you before sitting down and recording a conversation with you, that we would have learned from each other and understood each other better. And, maybe the next time we'll have a deeper conversation now that we've felt each other out and understand where we all think and all that stuff, But thank you for your time. I would love to talk to you again. Hopefully Chris and I didn't come off as a couple of brain dead idiots like we feel like we do sometimes. And where can people go find you so that they can consume your content?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on this show. I really enjoyed thoroughly talking to you guys. I thought it was great, and I'm open to future conversations, definitely. And if anyone wants to find me, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, X, kind of, and Substack. It's Crafty Thinking with a K, just like my last name, and YouTube as well, but I'm a little shaky on YouTube right now. So
Fair enough. Keeping up with all that stuff is really hard. We get it. So it's a lot. Yeah. It's a full-time job. I think people don't understand when they want to be a podcaster. They're like, oh, this will be easy. Guess again, bucko. All right. Well, thank you for your time again. You guys, please check out the show notes. We will link your like where we can find you on Instagram and YouTube and all that stuff in the show notes, so people can just click those links. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll catch you on another episode.
See ya.